Well, good morning or good afternoon, as the case might be. Welcome and welcome back, again, as the case might be. My name is Dalibor Petrovic. I'm a partner at Deloitte, and I have a pleasure of leading Deloitte's tech strategy and tech executive program in Canada. I have also had a pleasure of hosting this series of tech conversations that we have been bringing to our Canadian audiences for the last almost now coming to a third year. And for you who are returning, you would probably know that we use this channel to bring conversations with Canadian technology leaders who are shaping the future of our country. And we are also using this channel to share what we believe are timely and relevant topic for our technology leadership community. And today, it is one of those conversations. Today, we are going to talk about a very, very important and very, very timely topic of our country's economic outlook, and very specifically, how is this economic outlook impacting our tech sector? And when we think about tech sector, we are covering both our Canadian technology companies and startup, scale-up entrepreneur community, but also, of course, this is impacting our enterprise tech portfolio and leaders who lead tech organizations within our companies across industries. It is real thrill and pleasure to welcome three of my friends to this conversation. First, Trevin Straton. Trevin is the leader of Deloitte's economic advisory practice, and previously was the chief economist with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. So Trevin, thank you very much for your time. We're going to start this conversation by letting Trevin, who led the research and generation of our Canadian Economic Output Report, share his findings. I'm also thrilled to welcome back Monique Allen. Monique is the Executive Vice President and CIO, essentially, at OMERS. OMERS is, as many of you know, one of the largest Canadian institutional investors. And Monique is going to represent the Canadian tech, enterprise tech perspective in this conversation. And lastly, I'm thrilled to welcome Doug Schweitzer to the conversation. Doug is currently a senior advisor to Deloitte, but was previously, up until about 8-9 months ago, the Minister of Jobs, Economy and Innovation with the Government of Alberta, and was very instrumental in delivering the Alberta Economic Recovery Plan, which we all know included a very, very significant focus on diversification of specifically Alberta's economy into a tech sector. Or into the tech creation of the tech ecosystem. So thank you all very much for joining us. It's a real pleasure. For the audience members, this is a live webcast, which gives you the opportunity to engage with our audience. So if you do have any questions that you would like to submit, please use the Q&A feature of the Zoom platform, submit your questions, and we are going to do our best to address as many of the questions as we can during this session. So with that, Trevin, I'm going to pass it on to you to provide us with the latest and greatest on the Canadian economic outlook.
Thanks, Dalibor, and thanks for the invitation to be here today as well. So what I thought I would do is kind of do a bit of a table setting of what's happening a bit in the global economy, in the US economy as well, and then specifically focus on what's happening in Canada, maybe touching on a few areas that are very relevant to the tech sector. And that can kind of kick off the discussion for what we're seeing when it comes to how the sector fits in with these broader economic changes or structural changes in some ways that we're seeing. So first of all, if I were to, focus on what are some of the main takeaways, because I'm going to show you, quite a few graphs, quite a bit of data right now, over the next few slides. The first of all is that it's not only Canada that we see slowing down. Global economic growth is slowing right now too. Obviously, this has different impacts in different parts of the world. Certainly, when it comes to advanced industrialized economies, we're seeing very similar slowdowns taking place in Europe and in Australia and the United States as well. When it comes to some emerging markets, we're actually seeing relatively good growth this year. For instance, in India and China, China didn't have a great growth year last year, but it is rebounding this year and is driving growth going forwards as well as with India. We're also expecting the US, our largest neighbor, largest economy in the world, largest trading partner, to experience a modest recession this year too. And I'll get to some of the reasons why in a second. Secondly, is that rising interest rates are resulting in soaring debt payments for a number of consumers. Really part of the story, particularly when it comes to Canada, is that interest rates are really starting to bite now. Obviously, the Bank of Canada has been increasing interest rates since well into last year, but a lot of the time, interest rate increases take a little bit of time to work their way throughout the economy, usually a minimum of 6 months, sometimes even longer. We're really starting to see those interest rates bite now, and that's really contributing to some of the economic slowdown going forward in Canada. Also, that higher debt payments due to rising interest rates are severely impacting the housing sector, and also as more of people's money starts to be diverted towards interest payments, this is also having an impact on consumer spending, and that's also begun to decline as well. And then fourth, business investment remains soft, and that's over the short term, but also more so over the longer term. And this may have more to do with some competitiveness issues that we've seen more long term in the Canadian economy that have existed well before the pandemic too. So to start with the global picture, I mentioned that global growth is slowing, rising interest rates are really taking their toll. Of course, one of the big stories is, of course, the conflict in Ukraine as well, or the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And that's having an impact on the global economy in a number of different ways, particularly the Eurozone economy too. Certainly, we've seen it have an impact in terms of rise of certain commodity prices. We've seen it impact supply chains in certain ways, which have had an effect on increasing inflation too, and because of that of course puts more pressure on central banks to increase interest rates to address inflation as well. So right now we're expecting the US and the Eurozone to see a modest recession in 2023. But of course, this year global growth is relatively weak compared to what the average is. Apart from the financial crisis in 2009, apart from the pandemic in 2020, global growth is we're projecting to be or forecasting to basically be its lowest growth rate right now that it has been for the entirety of this graph. But then going forward, we're expecting a rebound. So even though we're not, global growth is going to slow down, we're not expecting a global recession. We're expecting certain parts of the world to see a recession. We're expecting it to be relatively short-lived, relatively shallow compared to other slowdowns or declines that we've seen, and being able to get back to growth maybe by the end of this year, certainly into 2024. To move maybe to the United States more specifically, obviously there have been some interesting changes in the financial sector in particular that have taken place over the past month. Of course, I'm referring to Silicon Valley Bank, to Signature Bank in the United States, of course, to Credit Suisse in Europe as well. And I think that there are a few main takeaways that we should talk about when it comes to these bank failures. First of all, though certainly the bank failures had a large impact on financial markets and on the economy, it's safe to say that they didn't necessarily result in contagion, right? That the bank failures were limited to a few banks, that we haven't necessarily seen that go through the entire financial sector, and that seems to have been arrested at this point. But then secondly, if we're talking about the tech sector in particular, obviously the failure of a bank like Silicon Valley Bank has an acute impact on the technology sector, considering a number of its clients and depositors, and that's had a bit of an impact on the tech sector, particularly in the United States. Then, of course, we should also probably talk about what might be the impact when it comes to the economy as a whole and when it comes to monetary policy decision makers. So certainly, most central banks have been between a bit of a rock and a hard place for a while now. On the one side, having to address higher than targeted inflation. And on the other side, by using interest rates to address higher than targeted inflation, potentially risking a recession. And so what's been happening with these recent bank failures is that the distance between that rock and a hard place has narrowed somewhat, or the ability of a central bank to find a soft landing spot has narrowed somewhat. Because despite there not being contagion and seeing more bank failures, what we have seen is that there are a number of unrealized losses on bank balance sheets, particularly in the United States. And so further interest rate increases could potentially impact that or drive us more into recession because of what banks have on their balance sheets. So central bank maneuverability has lessened a little bit, particularly in the US. When we're talking about the financial market in particular, something that a lot of people look to is of course the negative yield curve that we've seen. And so we've seen this for a little while. We see this both in Canada and the United States. But basically, how people are pricing in risk for short-term yields might be a higher risk than longer-term yields right now, which might mean that a number of investors are pricing in a potential recession in the short term. And so, when we're looking at potential indicators, this is something we've kept in mind. And of course, just the being able to see this has a certain impact on investor psychology and therefore on the economy too. Now, kind of moving forward to Canada, we have a very similar picture as the global picture and a number of similar economies around the world. So we are projecting a recession in Canada this year. Similarly, relatively short-lived, relatively mild, but a recession nonetheless. Really starting to kick in right now. So the next couple quarters aren't going to be great. But we're projecting to be able to, potentially get back to growth, or the economic picture is going to be a bit rosier by the end of the year, and then continue into a rebound in 2024. Now, one of the reasons why, and I'll get into the details in a second, is certainly one of the reasons why we're projecting a recession are the exact same reasons I was talking about when it comes to interest rate increases really starting to bite, putting downward pressure on GDP and economic growth. But then, of course, on the flip side, our labor market remains incredibly strong right now and incredibly tight. Our jobs numbers keep on coming in above target or above what's forecasted, and that's having a bit of a countervailing impact on interest rates. And that's one of the reasons why we're expecting a recession still to be relatively mild going forward. So on the downside, when it comes to interest rates, certainly we've seen household debt, which is relatively high in Canada after the pandemic, when we had a period of low interest rates. A number of individuals, of course, use that opportunity to take on more debt, particularly mortgage debt at the time as well, and we saw a significant increase in the housing sector. But now with interest rates increasing, we're seeing that start to bite when it comes to household debt to disposable income ratios. A lot more of household income is starting to go towards debt payments and interest payments, as opposed to disposable income or consumption. And so we're really seeing this start to divert funding away from what people have been spending on over the past few years. Consumption was relatively strong over the last little while. Quite a bit of money at the beginning of the pandemic went into savings accounts, and that has created pent-up demand for spending on consumption. Now those savings accounts are starting to be drawn down, or what was in the savings accounts. And then secondly, of course, more of that money is going towards debt repayment right now too, because of interest rates. We see a similar story when it comes to loan payments directed towards different parts of principal payments. So when we're looking at kind of interest payments, principal payments, we see a very similar story. The ratio of household interest payments and principal payments directed towards disposable income are changing right now too, and we see that happening in this graph as well. So in general, a lot more money is basically going towards paying off debt than it is going towards things that might spur economic growth, like consumption or investment, because of the economic conditions that we're seeing. Similarly, we see a very similar picture here when it comes to the ratio of household debt to disposable income, ratio of household interest payments to disposable income as well. Sorry, this is. And so part of the impact that this is having is on the housing sector, of course. So we see residential construction easing because as consumers might not be able to put as much towards housing, interest rates are higher, their mortgage rates are higher. This is having an impact on the housing market. And of course, when it comes to provinces, this is having a specific impact where housing is rather robust, like Ontario and BC. It's also having an impact on provinces like New Brunswick that have a significant forestry sector that is involved in housing too. And so we're seeing some of these numbers play out too. But what was important to keep in mind is that, I mentioned that it kind of takes 6 months for these interest rate payments or increasing interest rates to work their way throughout the economy. What we're seeing right now is that when it comes to people's mortgages coming up for renewal, this is having a bit of an impact too on what we're seeing in the housing market right now as well. And so we're forecasting this year isn't necessarily going to be great for the housing market when it comes to housing starts, when it comes to housing formation. But over the longer term, we're actually expecting the housing market to remain relatively robust, particularly because of demographics, because of population increases. We have very high immigration targets, and just for housing to be able to meet the demand for it, is going to put upward pressure on housing over the medium or longer term. Of course, related to what I was talking about when it comes to debt and interest rate payments, we're seeing consumer insolvencies on the rise, particularly when it comes to proposals. And you can see this from the light blue line, and that's of course having a bit of an impact. It's starting to bite. We may have not seen the worst of this yet. As I mentioned, the next couple of quarters might not be great, but we certainly start to see that hit consumers right now too, and start to hit households. Of course, this has impacted consumer spending too. So while consumer spending on the services actually continues to experience a rebound when it comes to travel, you may remember, at the beginning of the pandemic, the services sector was actually one of the hardest hit sectors, particularly because it required in-person presence to be able to go to restaurants or to be able to travel. That's still rebounding, while pent-up demands for goods purchases, particularly those related to housing, are in decline. And so consumer spending has been really what's driven the Canadian economy, not only during the pandemic, well before the pandemic as well. There are different drivers of economic growth, consumption, government spending, housing, business investment. Consumption has quite often over the past few years been the driver, but that's taking a bit of a hit right now. Now, on the flip side, those are kind of some of the negative factors that are impacting our economy. When it comes to one of the positive factors, despite slowing growth, the labor market remains very, very tight. And so, this is having a countervailing impact on those interest rate increases, because it's still putting upward pressure on wages, though certainly wages are not keeping up with the pace of inflation. But in terms of job vacancies, in terms of people keeping their jobs, in terms of people being able to find new jobs, and therefore having money to still spend, that's a bit of a counteracting factor. And it's actually one of the reasons why we're saying the recession is going to be relatively mild, because a number of businesses are expecting the recession to be somewhat short. They know how long it takes to get talent in this type of economic environment. And because of that, even though we're expecting a slight uptick in unemployment during a potential downturn this year, it's not going to be the same type of unemployment increases that we experienced in 2008 or in 2020, when we've actually had more significant downturns in terms of the impact on the labor market. So, one of the questions that we get the most from businesses around the country when we're talking about the economy and when we're talking about the labor market, and certainly when we're talking about the tech sector, is where have all the workers gone? And so we actually did a bit of a deep dive on this here at Deloitte in Canada, and we looked at what happened to the labor market, what happened to job participation rates during the pandemic. And what we noticed is that some of it is actually has quite a bit to do with demographics. So individuals kind of 55 and over actually left the labor market. They stopped participating in the labor market. Maybe interest rates were low, the housing market was booming. Perhaps they used their assets value that they had in their housing market to be able to retire a bit earlier than planned. The financial markets were doing relatively well. Perhaps their pensions were in a pretty good position as well. And we saw a lot of Canadians that were 55 and over decide to leave the labor market, potentially retire early. At the same time, we saw a bunch of what economists call core age Canadians, people 25 to 55. Their labor force participation rate actually increased during the pandemic, but it wasn't enough to offset those people that are 55 and over. And that's resulted in some demographic impacts when it comes to the tightness of the labor market. Of course, it doesn't only have to do with demographics, part of it has to do with skills as well. So we have seen a number of Canadians potentially take the opportunity to reskill or upskill at the beginning of the pandemic, go into higher skilled occupations, oftentimes, which are higher wage occupations as well. And we're seeing a bit of a mismatch between supply and demand in the labor market as well. Some lower skilled occupations are having difficulties just finding workers in general, because a number of Canadians have decided to go into different sectors or different occupations. Then, of course, in higher skilled occupations, there's just a challenge being able to find the skill sets that are needed, as opposed to being able to find workers in general. And we're seeing that particularly in the tech sector. Moving a bit to exports, certainly many exports coming out of Canada have to do with the energy sector and oil and gas in particular. But if we're looking at merchandise exports, these have really started to slow. And if we're projecting a recession in the US, that's not necessarily going to help it, because the US is, of course, our largest trading partner when it comes to merchandise exports. Something that we should keep in mind, too, is that, before a potential recession in the US this year, US imports of Canadian goods have been dwindling even before a potential recession. So while Canada hasn't been exporting as much to the United States has actually been importing, just not necessarily from Canada before recently. And that means that Canadian goods have had less of market share in the United States right now, too. Of course, one of the big questions I asked, or when it comes to exports, the energy sector is of course a very significant factor, and it is, with the situation in Ukraine, what's happened with energy prices. Of course, we saw a bit of an increase, a little leveling out that's happened recently. This has provided a boost to income, but we haven't actually seen it increase exports of energy products. And of course, energy products in Canada comprise a much larger proportion of our exports than it does for the size of the economy in Canada as well. And so an impact on energy exports is going to impact our exports writ large. And of course, part of this, of course, has to do with business investment too. Even though we've seen energy prices go up, we actually haven't seen business investment in the oil and gas sector go up along with it. If you look at historically, usually these two trend lines tend to follow one another. But since around the beginning of the pandemic, they haven't. Of course, some of this may have to do with some of the regulatory challenges that we have in Canada, or some of the infrastructure challenges that it has in Canada when it comes to investment in the sector. Of course, some of it might have to do with the energy transition that is taking place as well. And if there is investment taking place in other sectors other than oil and gas that are part of that transition. And of course, this is related to the US story that I was just mentioning as well. Of course, with the Inflation Reduction Act, this is having a bit of an impact too. And so when we're talking about business investment more broadly, this is what I was talking about at the beginning. Certainly, business investment in Canada has been historically lower than the United States, but it's actually been diverging since around 2011 as well. And what this means is many economists in Canada talk about productivity, of course, and Canada's productivity growth not necessarily being as high as many other countries around the world, including the United States. And that means specifically to the tech sector that a number of Canadian businesses aren't investing in technologies and in some cases skills at the same rate as businesses in some other countries. And of course, apart from business investment itself, this has an impact on the productivity of our economy more broadly. So as a kind of final forecast for the Canadian economy, as I mentioned, we're expecting to experience a relatively small recession right now. That's going to be hitting really over the next couple of quarters. But we're expecting to be able to get back to a little bit of growth by the end of the year. We're actually expecting inflation to continue to decelerate. You may have seen the numbers yesterday. Inflation is down to 4.3% from 5.2% the month before. We're expecting it by about mid-year to go down to 3.5%. Of course, inflation is still higher than target, but it continues to decelerate from highs from last June. And because of that, we're also expecting the Bank of Canada to potentially be able to start cutting interest rates before the end of the year as well, which of course will have a significant impact on growth going forwards too. And just as a bit of a picture at the regional or provincial level, as I mentioned, we're expecting the provinces that are more exposed to the housing sector to have the largest declines this year. And I mentioned some of the reasons why and what's happening in the housing sector in earlier slides. So I mentioned New Brunswick and why that might be, certainly Ontario, BC. We actually are expecting growth in a couple provinces still, being Manitoba and Saskatchewan. And a lot of that has to do with the rebound in the agricultural sector that's taking place this year too, which is contributing to significant growth for them right now. And so why don't I leave it at that, Dalibor, and pass it back to you to kick off the discussion.
This was a masterclass on economic outlook, global, Canadian, provincial. Thank you very much, Trevin. I'd like to invite Monique, representing the enterprise tech leadership. Monique, how are you experiencing the economic situation and the economic outlook?
Yeah, thanks, Dalibor. And I'm going to echo many of the remarks that Trevin made, but I'm going to, put the lens on as an enterprise technology leader. And some of those dynamics we're certainly experiencing, particularly when it comes to supply and demand of labor. And as he said, it's a very tight labor market in all areas and with all skill sets, and especially in tech. So here's how, some of what we're experiencing on the demand side, right? We know the world has changed since COVID, since we've all been sent home to work in alternate work styles, and every organization was put to the test on becoming more digital. So there's already been an increase in demand that's lasting from the last few years. We know the threat landscape is still very real. So we're still investing in resiliency in our organizations and the threat landscape. The economic conditions that Trevin just walked us through are creating a more permanent demand on technology to enhance the bottom line. And so we're looking for those productivity gains in organizations to enhance that bottom line. So the net is the demand for these skills are still lasting in the long run. And IT spending in enterprises is still strong. But some companies are offsetting increasing costs due to inflation and higher interest rates with layoffs, right? And so they're doing that to streamline operations and remain competitive in a very, rapidly changing economic landscape. Maybe some of them overhired in 2021, and they're releasing some of those employees. However, the value in technology is that human capital. And so I think organizations need to be a bit careful when they're releasing those resources. Once those resources leave, it's harder and harder to get people back. It also undermines the future productivity if we remove too many of those resources and too quickly. And so I think companies are also being quite careful about releasing too much of that skill set into the marketplace. Another factor I think that has influenced us in the last few years is organizations are thinking differently about how they access these talent pools, right? And particularly with hybrid work. So we're now competing on a global level for local talent, right? That pond just got bigger for many of us. And so the net is, I think it's still a competitive landscape for talent. The supply and demand of labor, as Trevin also pointed out, some of those skill sets have left the workforce in the last few years. And so that's continuing to make it a very competitive ecosystem as we continue to invest in technology in the enterprise.
It's a very interesting moment that we are sort of facing the mild recession coming. Organizations are looking at ways to become more efficient, and yet tech labor market is very, very strong. And what I've actually heard from Trevin really it's actually good news. There is a lot of good news coming for FY24 and beyond. It'll be a matter of how do we do smart moves over the next 6 months to preserve our core, right? While we continue to be looking for the right skill sets that are very, very light in the market, kind of is the theme. Monique, in your conversations with your peers and so forth, are you sensing that there is a general reduction on IT budgets in organizations? Do you feel it's flat? Any sort of reactions of that aspect of the business? We cover the people aspect of business a bit, but I'm interested in about the investment part of the business too.
Well, I think despite belts tightening, I think IT enterprise spending is still expected to remain strong. At the very least, I think organizations might hedge and keep their budgets flat, in this year, if not actually increase their spending in technology. And so some of the reasons that I was highlighting previously, it'll undermine our future productivity if we remove too many of these resources too quickly. It takes us time to onboard and to upskill resources when they join an organization. The threat landscape is still very real. And so those are very valuable resources in an organization, and the investment in cybersecurity is only increasing. And I think that creates that permanent demand, as we said, to enhance the bottom line, to find that productivity. And then, of course, we have on top of it, a really interesting landscape with technology innovation hitting us at a pace we just haven't seen it in years, and it's very real. And so I think, we're all thinking about how do these new skill sets, how do skill sets like advanced AI, the world's been abuzz with ChatGPT, and organizations are thinking competitively, still nascent, it's still not technology that's deployed at a large scale. However, it challenges business models, it challenges enterprise operations, right? There's new ways of thinking, perhaps new revenue streams, and an opportunity to offset costs and really drive productivity, not just in tech, but in so many other skill sets that really need to understand how to put these new technologies to the best use in an organization. And I think Doug and I were having an interesting chat just leading into this, right? And so what does that mean? The impact of AI in organizations, we tend to first think about the technical resources or the skill sets that we would need for AI, but it goes beyond the technology as we think about what might be coming. Yeah.
Doug, Monique touched on the important topic of Canadian tech ecosystem that's growing, that's very relevant. I'd love to get your reactions and your reflections on how is this economic situation impacting the Canadian tech sector.
Well, I think Monique nailed it when she mentioned the fact of how AI is going to impact, the complete business landscape in particular. And initially, people were concerned that robots and other things were going to disrupt kind of the physical labor market. But it looks as though right now, with the trends that we're seeing with generative AI, that the highly skilled workforce actually may be impacted even more and faster with the new technologies that are coming on. And I don't think this is something that people should be scared about. I actually think this is something that people should be looking at and embracing, is that AI co-pilot that'll allow you to do a project in an hour that would have taken you all day. It'll be the ability for kind of that next generation of young professionals to have broader skill sets and learn faster and provide better services faster with a higher quality control built into it. And so when I look at kind of the venture capital space in Canada, like Canada punches above its weight when it comes to VC investment. Just last year, the Canadian Venture Capital Association marked about 10 billion of investment in VC dollars in 2022. And that's widespread across Canada. Obviously, everybody knows about Toronto and Waterloo, Montreal, Vancouver being big markets. But even in the province of Alberta, where I'm from, 5-6 years ago, it was about 30 to 50 million in venture capital. Last year, it was over 700 million in venture capital. Saskatchewan had over 100 million. Manitoba had over 100 million. So you're starting to see this big ecosystem across Canada of venture capital investment. And the thing that's interesting, we had very frothy valuations, I would say, during the COVID time in the VC space. And you're starting to see a readjustment. You're starting to see some scaling back, more focus on profitability and kind of sound business principles. But that being said, with all of this momentum now around generative AI and the focus of what does that mean for the future, I think you're going to see that a whole new wave of startups getting significant valuations over the next 12 to 24 months as people really start to unpack, what does ChatGPT and generative AI mean for the business community? And it's going to be everything from government and health. It's going to also help us deal with demographic shifts in Canada. We've got an aging population, and how are we going to deal with those skills gaps that are going to happen when people start retiring more and more? So again, Delbert, I could keep going on, but I just think there's so many things that we can unpack here.
So what you are actually saying is that the headwinds that the economy is facing on productivity, on high interest rates, on what Trevin mentioned, systemic lack of investment by many organizations to make them more productive, that we in Canada happen to have the mighty mouse to the rescue in our vibrant and emerging tech ecosystem that is actually world famous for its, AI, right? And that if there was a different, better, more efficient, more effective way to connect Canadian ecosystem of tech companies with Canadian consumers of those services, which are the enterprises and industries and governments, we might have our own solution in front of us, right? In front of our noses, right? We got a question from the audience. Thank you, Gordon, for that question. How can tech sector participants and stakeholders, therefore, collaborate better to evolve to a point where these economic fluctuations have less negative impact to us? I'd love to get an open question to all three of you, open-ended question. Who might want to go first with that?
I can jump in on that.
Please.
I think we have to, right now, the disruption that's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years is going to be significant, no matter how you look at it. Like I've got young kids, they're in school right now, and they're looking at me going, well, Dad, do I really need to learn how to write the same way that you did? Or am I going to be able to use these new tools to accelerate my learning? And then I really just have to be more focused on research that goes along with it. So I think we fully don't comprehend yet how this is going to impact professionals, skills, education, and all of it that's going to be there. That being said, I think that we have to embrace it because it's here. If your business doesn't move on this, somebody else is going to move on it. I do think that the political landscape and the government landscape is going to need to do some catch up over the next 6 to 12 months for what are the guardrails to make sure that we have an ethical process, because the deep fake applications can be pretty significant. But I do think that we have to embrace this. From how to make sure that you don't have the big fluctuations in business and government, I think that if we do this responsibly, ethically, we have some amazing thought leadership on how this can improve people's lives. I think that's going to help win the day. The big worry I would have would be a disconnect from the general public that doesn't fully understand the capabilities of these tools, and we get too far ahead with the applications and disruption to labor market. We really have to bring the public along with understanding how this is going to improve lives and not necessarily disrupt everything.
Monique, any reflections from your perspective on sort of engagement with specifically Canadian companies, tech companies, who I think we have already established could be a part of the solution here?
Yeah, I think I thought Doug answered it beautifully, by the way. And the only thing I would add is we start to anticipate and really challenge ourselves to be creative in how new innovations can really change the landscape and the skills we need. We really need to look forward and act fast, right? And so what I mean by that is, one of the things that our team here actively engages in is strategic workforce planning. So what are those skill sets that we think that we're going to need in the future, and how are we building those skill sets? We can't just rely on hiring together. We need to build and evolve those skill sets. And so that is in every aspect of our business. It's not only technology. As we think about, never before do we need to partner together, or never as much do we need to partner together with all of our business teams to be creative, with our tech partners as well, right? With our big tech, we use all of them, right? They understand our business, but to really challenge ourselves to be creative in how we might apply these skill sets, and then create a path and a journey to get us there, to be able to build those skill sets. It's not just, as Doug said, it's not only a technologist's challenge, right? It's a challenge for an organization that can really think digitally and how we imagine the world where we can put these tools in use. One of the things that we encourage and we encourage the safe use and the responsible use of any of these tools, and we've got sandboxes set up. But I've asked all of my business leaders and counterparts, understand these, play with them, open an account, see what the power is, and imagine how your businesses might use these differently. And now is that time that we have to embrace this partnership together. It's like I said, it's not a technologists only realm, right? We really need to come together in this partnership and imagine a future world.
Yeah, if I can add to that too, I do a lot of work with investors, particularly when it comes to investment attraction. And obviously there are a lot of kind of competitiveness factors when it comes to the Canadian economy, like tax and regulation. And tax and regulation are of course incredibly important. But the number one thing that investors ask about when it comes to competitiveness is an ecosystem. And being able to kind of provide that, or even just market that in Canada and what we have here is incredibly important. They're looking for that workforce pool that Monique was talking about. They're looking for similar like-minded businesses, if they're a B2B business to work with, or even a business to potentially acquire or merge with as well, and looking for that type of environment too. And so I think that's incredibly important. Something I think we should also probably talk about is, we're talking about tech as a sector, but tech isn't really a sector anymore. Like technology is applying to all different sectors, when it comes to agri-tech or clean tech, or when it comes to smart mining or anything like that. And being able to kind of, if we're talking about the impact of artificial intelligence on the economy as a whole, creating the mechanisms that are going to be necessary for all of our sectors to adopt these types of technologies is going to be important for us to be competitive going forward.
That's very true. So we received a question about the international tech companies and their sort of views on Canada as a place to sort of invest, place to operate, place to establish themselves. So Trevin, Doug, any reflections on overall Canada's attractiveness and competitiveness to actually grow and land large tech companies and grow and scale our own? What would you suggest are some of the key challenges we are facing right now, and what might be some things that we could be doing differently?
So yeah, I do a lot of research on Canadian competitiveness and competitiveness more broadly. Obviously, there are a lot of indicators when it comes to the World Economic Forum. It has some. There's a great business school in Switzerland called IND, one of the best business schools in Europe, that has a great competitiveness indicator. Some of the top indicators for Canada, reasons why people invest in Canada, have to do with talent and education. So that Swiss study that I'm talking about, they talked to foreign investors around the world. They asked them, what are the main reasons why you invest in a particular country? For Canada, the top two reasons are talent and education, why a lot of foreign investors invest here. Now, considering the tightness of the labor market, that competitive advantage might be a bit more challenging than it has been historically. But of course, going forward, if we're able to resolve that with immigration, with upskilling and reskilling initiatives, we certainly have that we're able to leverage. Some of the reasons why investors choose not to invest in Canada, some of it has to do with the cost of doing business, the regulatory burden, things like that. Being able to reduce interprovincial trade barriers would have a huge impact on economic growth going forward. And so if we're able to address some of those things and still focus on our advantages, Canada is well positioned to grow going forward.
And just to add on that too, Dalibor, is that when you look at the Canadian workforce and what happened during COVID, remote work became much more commonplace. So we were seeing our tech ecosystem, even in the province of Alberta, having to compete with major global players that said, no, you can live in Canmore, live in the mountains, and work remotely for Google or Microsoft or name the big player. So very much it's a very flexible. So not only does Canada want to attract big investments, and politicians love cutting ribbons and having a big logo behind them and doing that part, but with the disruption from the pandemic and remote work, we have a very talented workforce that's very appealing to many people. So sometimes that also has an impact on kind of labor costs and the competitiveness for venture capital companies as well.
Very good. Yeah, excellent. I'm going to go to an interesting question that came from Michael. And this is actually a very, 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 very timely. Senior business leaders who actually like drive the strategies of our largest organizations, both in private sector, public sector. We do worry about the level of foundational knowledge and understanding of fundamentals versus, reading the latest airline magazine and making decisions that way. To what degree do you sense a need to have a more systemic tech fluency and raise the bar of the tech savviness and tech awareness with our Canadian boards who govern, our Canadian executives who make these big decisions? To what degree do you feel is there a gap in just foundational tech knowledge by the individuals who make these big decisions in Canada?
I can jump in. It's a
Please.
great question, Michael. Thank you. Near and dear to my heart as well. One of the things I think I bring sometimes some unique perspective is I've been on both sides of business. I've run a P&L, I've run a technology organization. And so, what I often run into in terms of tech fluency is just as we were talking about before, that the world is changing so much, and the rate of information that comes at us. Certainly know this is true of any topic in the media is just hitting all of our senior leaders at a much more rapid pace as well. And so do they really understand the decisions that we're making? I think it does come down to a couple of things. I think technology fluency is not, as we said before, it's no longer a technologist job. It's a business job as well. And I love that comment that there's, is there really such thing as the tech sector anymore? And we can debate about whether every company is a tech company. That's probably not true. However, every company is becoming more tech enabled, right? And so I think that is definitely a truth. And so fundamentally, we need to, and we're in a great spot as CIOs to teach and improve that fluency of not only our leaders, but our employees in the organization well, to embrace technology, to bring partnership, to co-lead in technology, and fundamentally change the way that we deliver. I firmly believe that every business leader, in the future going forward is going to be well served if they're also a digital leader. And I think that pairing is going to come hand in hand. And Dalibor and I have these conversations, I think, every quarter when Dalibor hosts his CIO Academy, and what's the path of a CIO or a CTO, and they're becoming invaluable to businesses to really understand how technology can be put to great use. And then I think the last thing I would say is on that education journey and finding those opportunities to create those primers, executive education, board education. I'm certainly seeing it in the boards I participate on, the boards that I present to, a real hunger for understanding the opportunities that come with technology that the board should be thinking about, and new and emerging risks that the board is concerned about as well. So I think it's such a rich question and is full of promise and opportunity, I think, on how we fundamentally think about running businesses in the future.
I think that we need to be starting to sound the alarm on fluency, tech fluency, actually in across the full life cycle, from elementary school education all the way through and including boards, because it intuitively feels this is going to be the battlefield for competitiveness globally. Already is. Right? It already is. We're already late to the game, but we need to be sounding the alarm. And what a great opportunity actually for tech leaders to now step up and educate their peers at the executive table, educate and help boards understand, and also influence, quite frankly, our politicians to invest more energy, time, effort, and resources to help our children grow tech savvy through our educational system. Trevin, a question for you specifically that came around the AI. We all touched on the topic of AI. We are all, I think, acutely aware of what's going on. How might this increased use of AI with predominant Canadian sectors like finance services impact their competitiveness? And do you feel that there is any particular sector that's really well positioned to increase its competitiveness using AI abilities? Of course, everybody else, please feel free to pitch in. But Trevin, what do you think?
And it has to do with one of the the economic challenges I was talking about. I didn't mention it specifically in the economic outlook, but I mentioned that, when it comes to business investment, Canadian business investment over the longer term hasn't been great or necessarily where we want it to be. What's interesting is that in the short term, we're actually projecting a bit of an uptick in business investment. Now, some of that has to do with relatively healthy corporate balance sheets, over the last little while, and they have a little bit of money to invest. But I think some of that actually has to do with what we were talking about earlier. There's an incredibly tight labor market. And because wages are going up because of that, a number of businesses are actually looking to invest in new technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, to be able to meet the needs of their business operations with higher labor costs. And some of that includes, working together with people, because I agree, we've been talking since the Industrial Revolution about technology taking over jobs, and we've been able to adapt, and we will continue to adapt with artificial intelligence going forward, and people being able to use that. That's kind of one of the trends I see on what businesses are doing right now when it comes to investment, which is very interesting. To the second part of the question, what particular sectors? It's a tough question to ask, because in some ways I go back to what are Canada's competitive advantages. And there are certain sectors where we have advantages, and we have historically had advantages. And if we don't adopt artificial intelligence, then we're going to lose that type of advantage that we have in that sector. And then there are that we're actually, if we're able to create them here, then because of the other advantages that we have, like when it comes to talent or other aspects of our economy, then we actually could be a significant player there. So I was mentioning, to me, it goes across sectors. Like technology isn't a sector or isn't a tool that applies to one sector over another. It's something that's happening to the economy writ large, and we need to adapt if we're going to remain competitive.
Yeah. In other words, everywhere the opportunities, everywhere the threats, everywhere the opportunities. I know, Monique, before we started, we had a chat. My job, and you had I think I'm listening that one. Mind, Monique.
But I think that AI is going to no doubt change and introduce a technological shock into our ecosystem. We've seen it before, though, right? We've seen it with automation, we've seen it with robotics, and at every opportunity, there's work that changes, right? And work that comes in with those types of technology advancements. And some of the most valuable resources that we have in those times of change are those individuals whose roles have changed, because they know the job, they know the work, and they know how these tools can best be implemented for productivity. I think that there are new jobs that will be created. There's always new jobs that are created, right? And so I think I'll go back to my comment of my earlier comments that we also need to think about how we continue to shift our workforce, right? And to train our workforce and evolve our workforce for what's to come, and particularly how we're going to put these new tools and innovations to use. So, will there be some impact? I think there will be some impact, but I think there's more opportunity than there's impact, frankly, and we've seen that in the past. And I think it is the comment maybe that you're AI that individuals need to fear. It's the person who knows how to use AI, right? It. And so I think that's I think that speaks to the evolving talent that we.
There is a moment of optimism in that, right? Because like we don't be afraid of the AI itself, but a person who knows how to leverage it, who knows how to use it, who knows how to put it in the context of the business problem that they're solving, that actually is what will be needed. So instead of fearing it, become that person if you can, right? That's, I think, a good message to take away. Monique, another question that came from the audience is, in this environment of economic headwinds, job situation, certain uncertainties, how does a tech leader plan for long-term investments and long-term moves and long-term strategy?
Yeah, that's a great question because, I would have answered that differently 10 years ago or 20 years ago, right? Where that time horizon, I think, is just getting accelerated. The honest answer is that nimbleness matters, right? Understanding and constantly evaluating the landscape and what's changing matters. And so those time horizons are shorter. I think we all think in terms of, 12-month, 36-month, 5-year horizons. And the reality is that in those horizons, there's so much change that happens that we certainly can't predict. And so I think that the art of logical change and strategy is revisiting it often, right? Being, humble enough to know that you're not going to get it right and that things are going to change, and to constantly reevaluate the landscape. To create a workforce that's nimble and is open to change and open to learning. I think I remember early in my career, we thought all the learning was done when we graduated university, or we did our first jobs and we were ready to just sail, and it couldn't be farther from the truth, right? We're constantly learning. And so when we create those elements as part of our culture, as part of our strategic plan, that we craft that nimbleness, it creates a result that can respond to change next horizon pace than we've ever been asked.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I do have one perhaps final question. Given that we have, of course, a very vibrant Canadian tech sector, and that many of these organizations are Canadian-grown companies, are looking for client number 1, client number 2, client number 3, even more than their next round of investment. How could we, as tech leaders, as a community of tech leaders, what can we do? How can we help? How can we better help? Any sort of reflection from all three of you is like, what else is needed or could be done to broker these relationships between our producers of insights, knowledge, capability, tech, and our buyers of that within the country?
I can get some perspective on that from my time in government, Alberta. Yes. The big challenge you have is that you've got procurement processes, and you've got, or big organizations, particularly like a government, that requires stability. They want to know that that partner is going to be there with them for a 5 or 10-year project horizon. And the challenge with a kind of venture-backed company that's scaling and growing and probably could add an immense amount of value is whether or not there's that certainty on the other side that, is this company going to be here long-term with me? I'm a big global player. So I would probably observe same thing for a big financial institution or a major energy company or infrastructure company. So how do we de-risk those relationships? How do we have a partnership? And maybe it is with a big platform like a Deloitte, or a partner that has some further stability, where it's more of an ecosystem approach for those first customers that de-risks it for those big buyers out there in the marketplace. So that way they know that they're going to have some certainty long-term.
Yeah. Monique, anything to add on that one?
I think Doug answered it beautifully. I don't have anything to add.
Yeah.
Same. I think Doug really hit the nail on the head there.
Wonderful. So let's maybe move into our closing sort of remarks. Trevin, you started us off. Maybe you can also sort of wrap us up with sort of your closing sort of thoughts on what you've just heard, and then we can go around the horn and then thank our audiences.
Yeah, I think, to kind of tie the two things together when it comes to the economic outlook and decisions that people in the tech sector are making, we are projecting a recession and a downturn, but we're not projecting it to be relatively long, and we're projecting it to be relatively mild. And those businesses that succeed in these types of environments are going to be the businesses that are able to take calculated and successful risks when others are maybe sitting on the sidelines, because there are a lot of opportunities in this type of economic environment as well. And so, for Canada to succeed, for tech companies to succeed, we got to be able to take those types of risks and to succeed.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you. Doug, any closing remarks on your side?
You see a lot of smoke and mirrors in tech every now and again. So there's a lot of buzz around metaverse a year or two ago, This one is real. When you look at the practical applications, even when you look at, Bing, who would have gone to Bing not that long ago? Nobody was going to Bing. All of a sudden, people are going to Bing's Copilot, and they're looking at it as a tool for workforce. So it's real. It's going to disrupt everything from health to education to how lawyers practice, like you name it. It's very real. The next 2-3 years, buckle up. It's going to be a fast ride.
Yeah. Monique?
I would just punctuate that. I know there's a lot of economic uncertainty that we haven't seen in many, many years, but we'll get through this. I think we've got some optimism. We've certainly got optimism for the economic outlook. We've got optimism for the technical outlook as well. I think these are game-changing times, frankly, and it's the competitive organizations are going to be the ones that embrace it. That desire to learn, to bring some creativity and innovation into how they get there and bring their people along with them.
Thank you very much, Monique. This was wonderful. Thank you very much, everyone, all three of you and our audience members who spent the last hour with us. We have recorded this session, and I'm going to make sure that this recording link gets into your mailboxes. For those of you following this channel, next week, I'll be joined by René Laforêt, the Interim Chief Technology Officer with City of Toronto. That is going to be a very interesting discussion. And then the week after, on May the 3rd, we're going to talk about how do organizations either create or erode value through digital transformation programs. So that'll be a very, very interesting discussion as well. So I would invite you all to come back same time, same day, same channel next week and the week after. And with that, thank you all very much.
Thanks, Dalibor.
Bye-bye.